They found a human femur on the church lawn right after the Sunday bell rang for the first time in 11 years. And standing beneath that tower was the priest's widow, calm, veiled, and silent, like she'd been waiting for the bones to fall. Turns out, she wasn't just mourning. She was digging. Watch the full story to find out how one woman turned a buried secret into a national reckoning. He screamed so loud the whole congregation froze. The bell tower had just rung out a second too late, and from the shadows, something fell, clattering to the grass below, brittle echo and all. And when the old groundskeeper rushed out, pale as a ghost, he held up a human femur bone, as if presenting the very wrath of heaven, and there among the shrieks and shouts stood a figure in a black lace veil, unmoving eyes, hidden but back too straight to be shocked. No one dared approach her, and no one could deny what she was, for the widow of the missing priest had come back to church, and with her came the secret that shattered New Orleans Trinity Church forever. My name is Ruth Mary Holloway, and I was born 2 blocks from this church, raised by Southern Methodists baptized in that very sanctuary. Before I was old enough to speak, I married Thomas Holloway when I was 19. He was already 35. A man of God, respected by all who whispered. He was a future bishop, maybe more if he had been born elsewhere. But we lived in New Orleans, and here faith had roots as twisted as the mossed oaks that guard its graveyards. My husband vanished. 11 years ago, the church ruled it a disappearance. Foul play suspected, but never confirmed. The diocese offered no reward, no memorial, no burial, just a photo in the back hallway and silence that echoed louder than any sermon. They stopped ringing the bells that year. No one explained why I stopped attending Mass the same week. They called me the ghost widow. I moved away, took a job as a nurse out in Baton Rouge, and let the silence stretch over a decade. But 3 weeks ago, I received a package at my doorstep wrapped in parchment with the church seal, not a return. Address only a message in faded ink. You were right. All along, come before September. I held it in my shaking hands, remembering Thomas' face the way he whispered scriptures before bed. And the last morning he kissed my forehead, told me not to come to Mass that day, because he had something special planned. He never came home. The new priest was young with a shaved head and crisp collar. He barely remembered the scandal. Reverend Miles Thatcher, eager, polite, and determined to rebuild the congregation. I sat at the back pew that Sunday with my gloves on and black, veil down. People whispered. Even the choir sang quieter. The air felt thick like honey and guilt together. The bell tower had not rung in 11 years, and yet at exactly 11:15 it pealed once loud enough to shake the stained glass, and then there was that crash, a sound like dry timber, snapping, followed by screams. They found more than one bone. The police came quickly and cordoned off the churchyard. Reverend Thatcher tried to calm everyone, quoting Corinthians, but his voice trembled. Someone threw up near the altar. A young girl fainted, the coroner said. The remains appeared to have been stuffed into the hollow of the bell structure and left to rot the femur. A piece of a rib and 3 small finger bones, yellowed but intact. I did not move, even as the crowd parted around me like water. Around stone I waited, until the forensic van rolled in, and then I stood, walked to the base of the bell tower, and looked up the clouds overhead, broke briefly, and sunlight hit the cross above, like judgment. A reporter approached me, her notebook ready. "Are you Mrs. Holloway?" she asked, her voice tight with sympathy or maybe suspicion. I nodded once she blinked, as if unsure what to say. Next, then asked what everyone had been whispering. "Do you think those bones could be your husband?" I did not answer. Not yet, but I knew in my bones the same way. You know when a storm is coming, that what lay up there in that tower was not just Thomas, not only his body, but the truth about what happened, the night. He disappeared, and the lie the church had kept buried ever since. Detective Harris came to see me 2 days later. White man, mid-50s, salt and pepper, beard coat too heavy for the weather, eyes like rusted nails. He had been on the original investigation, but it had gone nowhere. He sat in my kitchen, spread out photos like tarot cards, bones, angles, fragments. He asked if Thomas had any enemies, any debts, any affairs. I said no to all, but paused when he asked about arguments with church leadership. I remember Bishop Callahan back then, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, who told me once that a priest's wife should be heard only in prayer when I asked about where Thomas might have gone. He simply said, "Men of God, walk their own paths." That same bishop had died 7 years ago, stroke in the confessional, they said. But I always wondered if guilt could clog the veins like plaque. I started to go through Thomas' old things, boxes I had not touched in a decade, sermons scribbled on the backs of receipts, a letter half burned in the fireplace addressed to someone named Lethbridge, mentioning bell funds and silence money, and at the bottom the phrase, "It was never supposed to go that far." I brought the letter to Detective Harris. He read it twice, frowned, and said, "This could mean 100 things, but I think it means only one. You were right. Someone wanted him gone. Someone in the church. The way the bells stopped ringing, the silence. It all fits. The question is, why? And why now? Why send the bones down after all these years?" That night I stood in front of Trinity Church alone, the wind colder than it should be in August, and looked up at the bell tower. The shutters were open now, as if the tower itself had chosen to speak. After all this time, I do not believe in ghosts, not the way stories tell them, but I believe that places remember that wood absorbs, screams, and that walls can carry guilt like blood carries sin. I took off my gloves and placed my hand on the heavy oak door. The hinges creaked, and I stepped into the darkened sanctuary. Every step echoed. Every pew stared back like wooden mourners. I made my way to the altar, then turned and looked back. Down the aisle, where I had once walked in white, and where I would now walk in black towards something darker than death and more final than burial, the truth. Because I knew one thing, and it burned behind my eyes hotter than grief. Thomas had not left me. He had been taken, and the person who took him had sat in this very room Sunday after Sunday, playing pious and silent. And now the tower had spoken, and the bones were just the beginning. They said I should not return, that it would only stir the past, that the church needed peace and time to heal. But I did not believe in their peace, because peace built on silence is not peace. It is a coffin with no name. So the next Sunday I, dressed in black again, pressed my gloved hands over the same prayer book I had not touched in over 10 years, and walked past the hushed whispers and stiff backs of people who once called me Sister Ruth. Now they called me something else. They did not speak it aloud, but I saw it in their eyes, the woman who would not let the dead rest. But Thomas was not resting. He had never been buried, only hidden, and that is not the same. Reverend Thatcher greeted me with the same controlled smile he used on everyone, but there was tightness in his eyes, as if my presence turned the pews into tinder. I took my usual seat near the back, right under the stained glass of the pend. Archangel Michael, the one with the broken wing. No one sat beside me. The space around me seemed to hum with tension. The choir hesitated as they began the opening hymn, and I watched Reverend Thatcher place his notes on the lectern, his hands trembling just enough for me to notice. He preached on forgiveness that day, how convenient. His voice rose and fell with practiced rhythm, but there was sweat on his collar, and his eyes kept drifting toward the bell tower windows. I closed my eyes not to pray, but to remember the Rossend, last sermon Thomas gave the Sunday. Before he vanished, he had spoken of redemption through truth, of the cost of carrying lies. I remember how his voice cracked near the end, and how Bishop Callahan never looked up from his seat at the front. That was the last time I saw my husband alive. After service, I remained seated. I wanted to see who would come, who would dare speak to the widow who had opened the crypt. Everyone filed past without meeting my gaze, except one boy, perhaps 16, with dark curls and nervous hands. He hesitated, then approached with a paper folded in quarters, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think he wanted you to have this," he said, and pressed the note into my glove before hurrying away. I waited until the church was empty. Before I opened it, the paper was old, the ink smudged, but the message was clear. I heard them that night. The priest's quarters, the basement door was not locked. They made him go up. I do not know why, I want to know. But I remember the sound, the bell ropes snapping, and then silence. I never told anyone. Please forgive me. It was unsigned, but I recognized the handwriting. It matched a signature on one of the youth choir thank you cards. tucked into a scrapbook in Thomas' belongings from years ago. It belonged to Jonah Clark, the altar boy who had gone away to college out of state. I had thought he left after Thomas' disappearance out of grief, but now I wondered if it was guilt. I took the note to Detective Harris. He read it in silence, then said, "We need to find this, Jonah. If this is true, it changes everything." I asked what they had found so far. He said the bones were being analyzed, but early tests suggested blunt force, trauma, pre-mortem, and the small bones likely from defensive wounds Thomas had fought back. I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief, not anger, something colder, a kind of purpose. That evening I walked to the old rectory where Thomas and I had once lived. The front was boarded up, now weeds pushing through the fence as if nature had decided to reclaim what the church abandoned. I walked around the back, found the side door ajar. No one had bothered to seal it properly. The lock rusted through. I stepped inside dust, curling in beams of dying light. The kitchen smelled of rot and forgotten meals. The hallway still had the same cross on the wall, slightly crooked. I found the basement stairs hidden behind a panel. Thomas had shown me once for emergencies. Only, the handle was stiff but gave way, and the door creaked open, revealing stairs swallowed in darkness. I lit the small flashlight I brought, and descended slowly, each step groaning like it remembered the weight of secrets. The basement was dry, too dry, the air stale, the floor concrete cracked and stained. There were shelves of old communion, wine boxes of records, and then I saw it, scratched into the wall beneath the stairs, almost invisible. Unless you knew to look, was a carving in shaky block letters. God sees. I ran my fingers over the grooves as if trying to feel the moment it was written. I imagined Thomas down there, afraid, confused, trying to leave a message in case no one ever found him. My throat closed, but I did not cry. Not yet. Crying would come later when there was justice, not before. Back in my apartment, I began to make calls. I found Jonah through a college alumni page. He was living in North Carolina, working as a teacher. I left a message with my name, said I needed to talk about something from the church and that I could not wait. I did not expect a reply, but the next day he called, his voice thin as air. "I never meant for any of it to happen," he said. "They told me to stay quiet, that it would ruin the church. If the truth came out, I was just a kid." He told me about that night, how he had been asked to return a hymnal to the office, and heard voices raised not angry but desperate. Then silence. Then the sound of the bell tower rope being pulled, and then nothing more the next morning. Thomas was gone, and Bishop Callahan told the whole staff he had been transferred. Suddenly, they were not to ask questions, and if anyone spoke out, their future in the church was over. Jonah agreed to come back to New Orleans to speak with Harris. I thanked him, but I knew it would cost him everything to return. Some scars never fully close, and some ghosts do not fade. They just wait for someone brave enough to listen. When I returned to Trinity Church that Wednesday for evening prayer, I noticed something had changed. The air felt stiller, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Reverend Thatcher was not present. Instead, one of the deacons led a short reading from Psalms. But I could not focus because at the front pew closest to the altar sat someone I had not seen in years. Eleanor Callahan, the widow of the late bishop, her posture straight, her dress immaculate, and her gloved hands folded in her lap. She turned and met my eyes, and I swear something passed between us, not recognition exactly, but awareness I had. Come to uncover the past, and perhaps so had she, because behind that carefully composed expression, I saw something that looked like fear. The day Jonah Clark returned to New Orleans, the sky broke into rain, as if the city itself understood what was coming. He arrived wearing a faded gray jacket, his shoulders hunched like a man walking into his own funeral, and yet, when he stepped off the bus and saw me standing there, his eyes did not hold shame. Only resolution. We rode in silence to the precinct, where Detective Harris waited, his face unreadable, but I saw how he sized Jonah up, not as a suspect, but as a witness too long in the shadows. Inside the small interview room, Jonah sat down and exhaled, like he had been holding his breath for 11 years. He began slowly, voice shaking, but words clear. He spoke of the night Thomas disappeared, how he had been practicing organ. Upstairs, when he went to return a forgotten hymnal, passing the rectory hallway, he heard Thomas' raised voice, a name whispered in disbelief. Lethbridge, and then a scuffle. He peeked through the cracked door and saw 3 men in cassocks. Surrounding Thomas, one held a rope. Another, something heavy and sharp before Jonah could move. The bell rang once, then silence. And when he returned minutes later, the room was empty. Detective Harris recorded every word, then leaned forward asking only one thing. "Why did you never come forward?" Jonah looked at me before he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because they told me no one would believe a boy over a bishop, because they said it would destroy the church. And my family and I believed them. I was 16 and afraid. And I thought if I stayed quiet it would go away, but it never did." That night, as Jonah left the station, a rock shattered the window of his rental car. The glass glittered like ice across the sidewalk. No one saw who threw it, and no one came forward to admit they had seen anything. It reminded me of something Thomas once said: "When you dig in sacred dirt, expect snakes, not saints." I went to see Eleanor Callahan the next morning. Uninvited, I knocked on the large wooden door of the Callahan estate, nestled behind wrought-iron fences and rose gardens. "Now grown wild," she answered, wearing a lavender shawl and pearls, her hair perfectly coiled as if nothing had changed since the bishop's death. She looked surprised to see me, but not shocked, and after a long pause she opened the door and gestured me in. We sat in a parlor that smelled of old incense and regret. I asked her if she remembered Thomas. Of course she said he was a good man too, good to survive in a place like Trinity. I asked her what that meant. She stirred her tea slowly, her spoon clinking like a ticking clock, and said softly, "Thomas found out what my husband and the others were doing. He tried to stop it. He thought if he told the congregation the truth, they would choose to fix it. But he was wrong." She handed me a small velvet pouch from inside. She pulled a ring, gold and plain, with a tiny engraving on the inside. "Fiat lux, let there be light," she said. Thomas gave it to her the week before he vanished, asked her to keep it safe in case anything ever happened. She had kept it all these years in silence and shame. I asked why now. Why? Tell me this. She looked at me with eyes that had once belonged to someone powerful and said, "Because my husband is dead and I am not afraid anymore." Word spread quickly. The town murmured with new gossip, but no one said anything aloud. Reverend Thatcher called for a meeting with the church council behind closed doors. The next Sunday, he announced there would be a memorial for Father. Holloway. The bells would ring for the first time in over a decade. Not for mourning, he said, but for truth. But not everyone agreed. The old guard, the men who had once stood beside Bishop Callahan, who had written the official report of Thomas' disappearance. And they did not attend the memorial. They began whispering in corners, calling me a witch, a liar, a woman scorned. I was no longer invisible. I had become dangerous, and that made me a threat. That evening someone painted liar in red across my apartment door. I scrubbed it clean with vinegar and salt, my hands shaking but my spine straight. I would not leave. I would not retreat again, because the truth does not go away just because you ignore it. It waits, and now it was standing tall in the town square, ringing from the bell tower louder than ever. The memorial was set for the following Sunday at sunset. Reverend Thatcher stood at the pulpit reading Thomas' final sermon, the found tucked in a drawer of his desk, words about courage and light, and what it means to stand alone when everyone else chooses silence. As he spoke, the crowd shifted. People who had once turned away now leaned forward, eyes glistening with something like regret. When the bell rang, it did not sound like a toll. It sounded like a call, like the walls of the church were waking from a long slumber, like justice had finally cracked open the tomb and found its voice. But just as the final note faded, figure stepped into the aisle, dressed in grey hair pulled tight, face thin and angry. It was Leland Hart, former councilman, and once treasurer of the diocese. He shouted liar at the altar, accused Thatcher of corruption, accused me of fabricating the entire tale to ruin what little faith the town had left. The crowd gasped, and Reverend Thatcher stepped back, but I stood, walked to the front and faced Hart directly. My voice calm but firm. I asked him if he had been with Callahan the night Thomas disappeared. He said nothing. I asked if he could explain the missing funds from the bell tower restoration. He said nothing. I asked if he had ever confessed to what they did to my husband, and he turned and walked out, silent but shaking. That silence was louder than any denial. because everyone knew what it meant, and as he walked away, the congregation did not follow. Instead, they stood with me. Jonah stepped forward and placed Thomas' ring on the altar. The church remained quiet. But this time it was a sacred quiet, not the silence of fear but of mourning and truth. Later that night I walked through the cemetery behind the church. The moon was high, and the gravestones cast long shadows. I found the empty plot where Thomas' name had finally been etched into stone and knelt beside it, not to cry but to promise that his story would not be buried again. I placed my hand on the cold marble and whispered, "I am not done yet." Because there were still questions, still records sealed, still people hiding behind robes and rituals. But now I was not alone, and that made all the difference. The town had chosen silence once, but not anymore. Now they were listening, and soon they would be ready to speak. The morning after the memorial, the bell of Trinity Church remained still, but something inside me had begun to stir like a locked chest, finally breathing air. The sound of that single clear peal still echoed in my bones, and so did the silence that followed it. But what haunted me most was not the bell. It was Leland Hart walking out of the sanctuary without a word. Not denial, not defense, only retreat. And I knew then with absolute certainty that he had been there that night, the night my husband Thomas vanished. Detective Harris called me just after sunrise. His voice clipped. "Something had happened," he said. "Meet me at the rectory. Bring anything you have left from Thomas and hurry." I arrived within the hour, clutching a box of old journals, sermon notes, and one weathered Bible tucked beneath my coat. The rectory door was open. Harris stood at the base of the stairs to the bell tower, his face pale. He didn't speak at first, just pointed upward. The steps creaked with age and memory, and when I reached the top, I nut froze, because someone had returned during the night. Someone had left something new. In the center of the bell floor, where dust had settled thick over the years, lay a book bound in cracked leather, and beside it, a single white lily fresh damp with morning dew. The flower was impossible. The room had no open windows, no vase, no water. And yet it was real. I bent down, slowly opened the book, and saw Thomas handwriting. It was his journal. Not one I had seen before, the entries dated only weeks before his disappearance. I read in silence. Harris, waiting below the journal, spoke of fear, not for himself, but for the church he loved. He wrote of secrets passed in dark corners, whispered through liturgy, things he had uncovered in old ledgers and forgotten archives, payments to names that did not exist, restoration budgets with no materials ever ordered, a brotherhood of silence, masked as tradition, and above all, one name repeated again and again, Lethbridge. I showed Harris the journal. He scanned it, jaw tight, then made a call to the state attorney's office, and said it was time to open old files, said we finally had more than bones. We had a map, and at the center was a man named Lethbridge, who no one seemed to remember, but who had left footprints everywhere, and perhaps most haunting of all, not once did Thomas write that he feared for his own life. He feared only that no one would listen. Jonah met us later that day. He looked stronger, his voice steadier, as he flipped through the journal, eyes wide. "I remember that name," he said. "Lethbridge. He used to visit late at night after Mass. I thought he was a guest priest, maybe a visiting scholar. Bishop Callahan always met him in the bell tower. Not the rectory. I thought it was odd, but I never asked questions. I was too scared, and now I wish I had." I asked Harris if Lethbridge was ever officially registered with the church. He said no. He searched diocesan records, national clergy logs, even Vatican registries. The name appeared nowhere, at least not as clergy, but when cross-checked with property filings and donor records, Lethbridge came up 5 times, all tied to Trinity and its satellite missions, and every time just before a priest was transferred, disappeared or died suddenly. The pieces were falling into place, but we still had no face, no address, only a name, a ghost woven through ink and ledger. We needed more, and it came that evening in the most unexpected form, a knock on my apartment door, an envelope slid beneath, and when I opened it, my breath caught inside. Were photographs, black and white, grainy but sharp enough to see a group of men standing outside the bell tower. Years ago, robes pressed smiles posed among them. Bishop Callahan, Leland Hart, And one man, whose name I had never heard, but whose eyes were unmistakable, cold, sharp, and knowing on the back of the photo was a single line handwritten in ink. Lethbridge, real name, Elias Munro, born 1939, and buried secrets. With Thomas follow the money. We took the photo to Harris. He scanned it into evidence, and then pulled up an old news article from 1987. Church benefactor dies in fire. Munro estate left to Archdiocese. I remembered the name now vaguely from a fundraiser. Years ago, a mysterious donor who never spoke, never attended Mass, but always wrote checks with heavy hands and darker intentions. We drove to the site of the former Munro estate, a mansion turned retreat center now empty, shuttered after a fire. 2 decades earlier, the ground's overgrown fences, rusted gates wide open as if waiting inside the charred remains of the chapel. We found more than ash. We found a vault in the floor, once sealed, now broken. The concrete chipped, the hinges melted from heat, and inside scattered remnants, old documents, bank transfers, letters, coded sermons, one signed with a seal, matching trinities and a passage from Revelation carved into the stone wall behind it. The blood of the saints shall cry out from the stones, and justice shall rise. I stood there in the cold, damp, dark, breathing dust and judgment, and I thought of Thomas alone in the tower, surrounded by men who feared light more than hell, and I thought of every silent Sunday that followed, every hymn sung over lies, and every prayer that asked for grace while hiding murder. The case was now active. Harris filed for warrants. Subpoenas traced the funds back to Shell. Accounts now frozen. The church released a statement calling for unity and caution, pleading with parishioners not to judge before all facts emerged. But the town was no longer deaf, no longer blind, and in the pews people whispered, not about me, but about truth. That week, Reverend Thatcher approached me after service, his face pale, his eyes haunted. He confessed he had known something was wrong the moment he took the assignment, but had been warned not to dig, not to disturb the past, not to awaken the tower. He apologized with shaking hands, said he never imagined it was murder, said he would testify if needed, and I believed him because fear had once ruled me too, but not anymore. I visited Thomas' grave again. That night, candles lit around the stone placed by strangers and friends alike. The town that once turned its back now offered vigil, and as I knelt, I heard a sound behind me, soft, deliberate, a footstep on gravel. I turned, heart hammering, and saw Eleanor Callahan standing beneath the oaks, eyes hollow shawl wrapped tight around her thin frame. She stepped forward, placed something in my hand, and whispered, I have one more thing to show you. It was a key, old brass, heavy stained with age and memory, and on its tag the words, Rectory West Cellar, do not open without council approval. She said nothing more, and walked away, disappearing into the trees like a ghost, finally setting down her lantern. And I stood there beneath the bell tower, key in hand, heart pounding because I knew what was coming. The door that had remained locked for over a decade was about to open. And behind it lay the final piece. The key in my palm felt colder than iron, heavier than memory, its brass teeth catching the moonlight as I stood outside the west cellar door of the old rectory. This was the last door. Thomas never spoke of, the one only the church council had access to even when we lived here. I had asked about it once, and he simply said, some places were built for silence, not shelter. And now, with the town beginning to stir and the truth gasping for breath, I could not wait another day to know what had been hidden behind it. Detective Harris met me just after dawn, his coat dusted with dew, his face drawn. We said nothing as he inserted the key and turned the lock. It gave way slowly, the sound of rust and dread grinding together, and then the door creaked open, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward into cold stone and deeper still into the parts of Trinity Church that the congregation had forgotten or perhaps never truly knew. We descended with flashlights in hand. Every step groaned under weight, not just ours but that of secrets pressing from the walls. The air grew colder, damp, the kind that clings to skin and memory, and when we reached the bottom we found a narrow corridor leading to a single chamber sealed with an iron gate. Someone had carved Latin into the wall above it. Lux veritatis et mortem, the light of truth and death. Inside the chamber, the air smelled of ash and mildew. We stepped in slowly, our lights flickering over wooden shelves lined with old scrolls, boxes of church documents, candles melted into the stone. But what stopped me was the far wall and what hung upon it. A tapestry rotted with age, but clear enough to reveal its image. A serpent coiled around a cross, the mark of a forgotten sect, and below it a name stitched in thread, barely visible, Lethbridge Society. This was no ordinary storage. This was a vault of knowledge, a reliquary of guilt. Harris began opening the boxes one by one. Each held letters dated back decades, receipts for payments to unnamed persons, files on priests who had vanished. Suddenly, letters marked with red wax and names struck out in thick ink. Some bore Thomas' signature. Most did not. But in the center of the room sat a table, and upon it a single bound ledger, untouched by time or mold, and on its cover a name that stole the breath from my lungs. Thomas Holloway. I stepped forward, hands trembling, and opened. The book inside were pages of his writing, notes, theories, calculations. But it was not sermons. It was a journal, an investigation, a record of every oddity he had uncovered within Trinity, each unexplained disappearance, each transfer of funds, each member of the clergy who had resigned without explanation. He had known more than I ever imagined, and at the end of the book, written in ink that bled as if even the paper wept, was a final entry. If you are reading this, I am likely gone, and if I am, it means I was right. They will protect the name above all else. Lethbridge is not a man. It is a doctrine, and it feeds on obedience, silence, and fear. But if truth still means anything, must not let it die. Down here with me, the garden above may be blessed, but beneath it lie bones buried. Not with prayer, but with purpose. I dropped to my knees, the floor freezing against my skin, and I wept, not the grief of loss, but of knowing that he had fought alone, and still tried to leave me the tools to finish what he began. Harris put a hand on my shoulder, silent, and steady, then stepped toward the far corner where the ground was different, slightly raised and disturbed. He began to dig with gloved hands, and after only moments his fingers hit wood. It was a box, simple pine weathered by time, and when he pried it open the smell of decay filled the air, and there, beneath layers of cloth, we found what we never expected. A skull, teeth, cracked bone shattered by force, and next to it a collar, still bearing the imprint of the cross, and a chain with Thomas' wedding ring threaded through it. Harris turned away to call the coroner, but I stayed, kneeling, hand over my mouth, eyes wide, because I knew then the man buried in that cellar was not Thomas. The ring was his, but the skull was not. He had been here, he had fought, he had died, but not alone and not here, and someone had gone to great lengths to mislead us, to plant this decoy and buy themselves time. I looked up at the tapestry again, and saw something I had missed before, a seam down its side. Loose threads tucked just behind. I pulled gently, revealing a hidden alcove, and inside was a small iron box locked and sealed with wax bearing a strange crest, a lily wrapped in flame. I broke it open and found photographs of ceremonies, men in robes standing in rings holding candles over kneeling children, faces blurred, some scratched out entirely, and at the back one photo caught my breath. Thomas bound at the wrists, kneeling in the bell tower, surrounded by men whose faces were half-shadowed, but one clearly visible. Leland Hart. Not years younger, not a witness, not a coward, but a participant, and in the corner a symbol branded into the floor, the same as on the tapestry, the serpent, and the cross. I took the photo to Harris, his face drained of color. He said, "This is enough. We can take this to the state. We can press charges." He asked if I was ready for what would come: the press, the trials, the exposure of a sacred place turned sacrificial. I looked him in the eye and said, I was not just ready, I was born for it, because my silence had cost me 11 years, and it would cost them nothing more. That night I walked the garden above the chamber where saints were buried, where flowers bloomed and children played. I looked at the statue of Michael the Archangel's sword, drawn wing broken, and wondered how many times he had watched from above, as innocence was buried beneath. I touched the stone and whispered, I found him, not just Thomas, but the truth, and I swear I will not let it be silenced again. Eleanor Callahan found me there. She walked slowly, her cane tapping the path, her eyes heavy with something deeper than sorrow. She handed me an envelope, no words, just a nod, and walked away. Inside was a confession, handwritten pages detailing, and the final meeting between the bishop and Thomas, how Thomas had demanded the tapes be turned over, how he threatened to go public, and how the bishop had called Leland. That same night the letter ended with a line that made me shake. I begged him to let Thomas go, but he said, "Truth is not good for the flock," and then he rang the bell himself. The bell that had signaled a beginning and an end. I closed the envelope, placed it beneath my coat, and looked back toward the church, its spire rising into the night, and for the first time since his disappearance, I felt Thomas near, not as a ghost, but as a guide, and I knew there was still more to uncover, still more to fight, but now I had a voice and soon the whole town would hear it. It began with a whisper late at night after the garden had emptied, and the flowers at Thomas's memorial had begun to wilt. I was sitting in the dark corner of the living room, Thomas' journal open beside me, the photo of him bound, surrounded by shadows, pressed under glass when the phone rang once, then twice, then stopped. I let the silence settle before it rang again. I answered and heard nothing at first, only breath. Then, a voice soft, young, trembling. "It's me, Jonah." I stood frozen, the weight of all we had uncovered, pressing against my spine. Jonah's voice cracked as he spoke. "I need to tell you everything, not just about that night, but about what happened after, and what they made me do, because the truth is I wasn't just a witness, I was part of it." The next morning he came to my apartment, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot and sunken, like someone who had not slept in days. He sat at my table without touching the tea I made, and held his hands between his knees like a child about to confess a crime from long ago. I was in the bell tower when they brought him up. His voice was flat, not numb but hollow, a space where emotion had once lived. I didn't mean to be, but I'd gone up there to smoke. I'd stolen a cigarette from the janitor and I didn't want anyone to see. He paused, pulled out a crumpled photo. From his coat, a faded snapshot of the bell tower staircase, empty, except for a rope coiled like a snake at the base. They didn't know I was up there. I watched from above as they forced him inside. Thomas wasn't screaming, but he was pleading. I heard him say Eleanor's name. I heard him say, "God forgive you," and then heart hit him with something hard, and he fell. He didn't move after that. Jonah's fingers trembled as he pressed the photo onto the table. I stayed silent, not out of judgment, but because I wanted him to finish. They made it look like he ran. They took his clothes, his Bible, his ring. They planted the collar on that other man. I don't know who he was, just that he was already dead. Maybe someone from the old shelter, the one that burned. No one ever identified the body. They said it was an accident. I think that was the first cover-up, and I think they used him again to make it look like Thomas. I asked why he had never said anything before. Jonah looked at me like I was asking a man underwater. Why he hadn't screamed. He said I was 16, they said. If I talked, I'd burn that. I'd never see my family again, that God would turn his back on me. And I believed them. I believed everything because they were men of God. He began to cry then, not loud, just quiet, sobs that bent him forward. I reached across the table, placed my hand over his. He gripped it tightly like someone drowning. I thought, if I left town, if I ran far enough, the memories would stay here, but they didn't. They followed me every night, every time I sang a hymn or heard a bell. I saw him, and I saw myself hiding, doing nothing. I asked what had changed. Why? Now he looked up and whispered, "Because you didn't run, because you stayed, and because the bell rang again," and I think maybe that was Thomas asking me to speak. That night I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by papers, tapes, the ledger from the cellar, Eleanor's confession, Jonah's photo, the journal Thomas left behind, and I realized we now had everything, enough to go public, enough to go to trial, but not yet enough to bring peace, because one name remained unspoken, one final veil not yet lifted. Elias Lethbridge, or Elias Munro, the man who had started all of this. If he was dead, then we needed his burial site. If he was alive, we needed his breath on record, and if he was somewhere in between, then we needed to find his shadow. Detective Harris arranged for us to meet with a retired federal investigator who had once probed cult activity linked to religious organizations. His name was Stephen Wakefield, and he wore a hearing aid, a dusty suit, and an expression that said he had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. He listened to everything we had uncovered, flipping through documents slowly, and when we mentioned the name Lethbridge, his eyes narrowed and he muttered, "Son of a bitch," under his breath. He pulled out a folder from his battered briefcase. Inside were photos of burned buildings, hand-drawn maps, newspaper clippings from the 70s and 80s, and at the center, a photo of a man with hollow cheeks and eyes that saw too much. "This is Elias Munro," he said. And yes, he was Lethbridge too. That was the name he used when he led the Order of Refined Light, a group that splintered off from the main church decades ago. They claimed divine visions. They practiced silence, fasting, and eventually violence. 3 priests died during their time with him, all ruled accidental. 1 disappeared. Munro vanished, not long after, but rumor was he came back under different robes, different names. He had followers, powerful ones. They made sure the records stayed sealed. We asked if he thought Munro could have been at Trinity. Church Wakefield nodded. I'd bet my pension on it. Munro always believed in sacred geometry. He built his churches atop old foundations, places with dark history. Trinity sits on top of what used to be a plantation chapel that burned in 1823. No surprise he'd use it again. Every move he made was a ritual. I asked if he thought Munro was still alive. Wakefield didn't answer right away, then said, "Some men die and keep walking. Some men live only in whispers. I don't know which he is, but if you find where he died, you'll find everything." That night, Eleanor Callahan came to see me again. Her movements slower, her breath thin. She said she had remembered something. A name carved into the base of a statue outside the church in the Garden of Saints beneath St. Dismas. "The penitent thief," she said. Thomas once told her that if anything happened to him, she should look there. We went by lantern light, passing through the dewy grass, past the gravestones toward the marble statues at the edge of the garden, and there, beneath St. Dismas, we found it, a name barely visible, Elias M., and a symbol beneath it, the serpent and cross. Jonah stood beside me, his hands clenched at his sides, and whispered, "He's here, isn't he? They buried him here like one of the saints." I nodded slowly, because the truth was not just in the papers or the cellar or the bells. It was in the soil, and it had been feeding the roses and prayers for years. We stood in silence as dawn crept over the garden, birds beginning to sing, and the statue casting its shadow over the name of a man who had buried light and called it worship. We were almost at the end, almost, but not yet, because the truth was out, but justice had not yet arrived, and until it did, I would not rest. And neither would Thomas. The morning light touched the tip of the St. Dismas statue, like an answer to a prayer I had never dared to say aloud. And I stood there, hands covered in dirt, breath, shaky heart, pressing against my ribs, because beneath that statue, beneath all the years of sermons and ceremonies and silence, lay the name Elias M. carved, not in reverence but in warning. And suddenly it all made sense. Trinity Church had not buried a secret, it had built itself upon one. Detective Harris wasted no time. He ordered ground-penetrating radar brought in by noon, and within hours the results came back clear and precise, a coffin-sized anomaly, 3 feet beneath the roots of the rose bushes just south of the statue, a burial that had never been recorded, never blessed, never spoken of, and yet undeniably present. The church council tried to halt the dig, claiming sacred ground, but the court order had already been signed, and the town was no longer willing to be silent. Accomplices. The crowd gathered in grim silence by dusk, not a vigil this time, but something colder, more exacting, justice in progress. And I watched as the men in gloves and uniforms peeled back the layers of earth, revealing a box blackened with time. The publictor, metal tarnished, the hinges sealed tight. The coroner stepped forward, crowbar in hand, and with one creak, and then another, the lid broke free, and the stench that poured out was enough to silence even the most defiant. Inside was a skeleton robed in black, with a silver pendant still shining, despite decay, a serpent wrapped around a cross, and tucked into the chest cavity, where a heart, once beat, was a journal bound in leather, untouched by rot, as if it had. We'd been waiting not to decay, but to be read. Detective Harris handed it to me, his gloves trembling. I opened the first page, and there, in tight, angular handwriting, were the words of Elias Munro, also known as Father Lethbridge, also known as the beginning of all this darkness. He wrote of ritual, not superstition, but purpose. He believed the church had grown soft, had abandoned sacrifice and truth for comfort and illusion. He wrote of building Trinity as a sanctuary of discipline, a haven for those chosen to carry the real burden of faith. He spoke of Thomas by name, spoke of the night he summoned him to the bell tower, of how Thomas refused the covenant of silence, of how he tried to expose the brotherhood, and how his defiance had to be answered. I closed the journal before finishing the page. My stomach turned because it wasn't just murder, it was doctrine. It was theology twisted into chains and thorns. And I realized then, Thomas hadn't simply been silenced for uncovering corruption. He had been killed because he threatened a belief system older and deeper than any Sunday sermon. Jonah stood beside me, silent, pale, and still, until he whispered. He wrote my name. I turned pages faster now and there. It was the choir boy, the initiate, the one who watched from above must never speak. The journal recorded everyone who had stood near the tower that night, and what role they were meant to play. Some became brothers, others were discarded. But Jonah, he was marked as both witness and risk. I looked at him, but he only nodded, like he had known all along that he was part of something far more sinister than cowardice. And as the coffin was sealed again, this time for evidence, not burial, the town began to shift, people whispering, not about me or Thomas, but about how many lies had been baked into the very foundation of their faith. That Sunday the pews were full, not for mass but for reckoning. Reverend Thatcher stepped to the altar, not in robes but in a plain black suit. He spoke not of salvation but of repentance, of how he had chosen silence for safety, and how that silence had become complicity. He invited every member of the church council to come forward and speak. None did, not even Leland Hart, who sat stone-faced in the second row, arms crossed, as if defiance could still save him. But then, Eleanor Callahan rose her cane, tapping against the marble floor, and she walked slowly to the pulpit, her voice thin but unshaking, as she read from her husband's personal writings, confessions not meant for eyes, but for penance. She spoke of nights spent in fear of the man named Lethbridge, of rooms she was never allowed to enter, of screams she heard in the rectory that were never explained, and finally of the night Thomas died. She said he came to our home and begged for safety, said he had proof and needed to show the congregation in the morning, and the bishop told him he would protect him, but that night he went to the tower and never came back. And when I asked why, my husband only said the church must survive no matter the cost. The room was silent, but not in mourning. This time it was a silence of transformation, as if everyone in that sanctuary understood something had ended, and something else had begun. When Eleanor finished, she placed a small box on the altar. Inside was the original bell clapper, removed 11 years ago after Thomas vanished. Removed, not because it was broken, but because it held blood dried into the iron flaking beneath rust. Proof that the bell had rung not to summon worship, but to mock death. The investigation widened. State prosecutors issued subpoenas, the bishop's old correspondence unsealed, and read in court the names of former clergy who had gone missing. Suddenly made sense. And in the middle of it all, Jonah came forward with his full testimony, not just to law enforcement, but to the press, to the town, to every member of Trinity who had looked at him as a child and failed to see the trauma behind his eyes. He stood before a packed courtroom weeks later, voice clear and hands steady, and said, "I was there. I saw them kill him, and I said nothing for 11 years because I was afraid, but fear is not an excuse, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm demanding truth because he deserves it, and so do we." I watched from the bench beside Eleanor and Harris as the gallery fell still, and when Jonah stepped down, a woman rose from the crowd, walked up to him and wrapped him in her arms. Not a relative, not a lawyer, just a stranger who had heard enough lies and wanted to offer something real. The cellar at Trinity is now sealed with iron and stone, the garden replanted not with roses but with lilies, white and tall and reaching skyward, and in the center a single plaque etched with the words for the silence that was broken, for the light that endured, and for Father Thomas Holloway, whose truth rang louder than the bell. But we were not finished. Not yet, because one man still walked free. Leland Hart had vanished the night after Eleanor's testimony. His car found abandoned on the levee, his home stripped of files, the walls scraped clean, and yet his name remained like a shadow across every page of this story. And I knew we would find him, not with police, not with search warrants, but with the truth, because the truth has a way of dragging men into the light even when they run. And I would be waiting, because Thomas had waited. And I was done waiting in silence. 3 weeks passed since the courtroom held Jonah's trembling voice like sacred scripture, and still no one could find Leland Hart. The man who once stood at the center of every council meeting now became a ghost in the same town. He helped control. They checked motels, old addresses, properties under aliases, but he vanished with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting disappearance. And yet I knew he hadn't gone far, because men like him never flee. The fire, they simply hide in its smoke. It was a Thursday when I received the envelope. No stamp, no return address left in the tray of my mailbox like a dare inside. Was a funeral program printed in soft blue ink bordered by doves and lilies, and at the center, the name of the man we had all buried too soon. In loving memory of Father Thomas Holloway. I stared at the page, heart-stilled breath, locked. The funeral was scheduled for Sunday at a private cemetery outside. City limits, not the one where the plaque stood, not the Garden of Saints. This was someplace no one had spoken of. Location scrawled in pen beneath the printed address. Oakfield Remembrance Park, Lot E, Section 4. No clergy, no officiant, no public notice, and yet someone had gone to the trouble of organizing it quietly, and if I knew anything by now it was. This Leland Hart wanted me to come. Detective Harris advised against it, said it could be a trap. Jonah begged me not to go alone. Reverend Thatcher offered to accompany me, but this was something I had to do myself because Thomas' name had been spoken by strangers for too long, because the lie had been buried, and now the truth demanded a grave, even if I had to dig it myself. I wore black again, not out of mourning but defiance black, that no longer hid my pain but carried it with sharp dignity. I arrived at Oakfield just before dusk, the cemetery nearly empty rows of marble standing like sentinels in the fading light. And far in the distance, under an oak tree, a figure stood beside a closed casket. It was Leland Hart, older, thinner, but unmistakably him, his hands clasped behind his back suit, wrinkled face, hollowed out by time or guilt or both. He didn't turn as I approached, just spoke as if we'd been mid-conversation for years. "You were always going to find me, Ruth, you and that damned bell." I didn't answer him, not yet. I let the silence carry the weight of all that had passed, until I finally said, "Is this supposed to be redemption or mockery?" He looked down at the casket, his jaw clenching. "I never wanted to kill him." "Then why did you?" "Because he threatened to burn it all down," he said it, with such cold calm. I felt the chill rise up my spine. He had the files, the photos, the names. You know what that would have done to this town, to the families, to the church. You think you're saving something, Ruth, but you're not. You're dismantling the only thing that gave these people order. I stepped closer, voice low and steady. Order, built on bones, is not order. It's rot, and I won't carry it another day. He turned then, eyes sunken dark circles beneath them, and I saw not a monster but a man undone, not by truth, but by the long, slow decay of hiding from it. "Do you think it was easy?" he snapped. "Do you think any of us slept after that night? We built that bell tower together. Ruth, you and I and Thomas and Callahan. We raised it like a monument, and then he made it a grave." I stared at him, the wind pulling at my coat, the weight of the last 11 years settling into my spine. "No, Leland, you made it a grave. He tried to make it a beacon." He fell silent then, and for the first time I saw his hands tremble, not with rage but resignation. He opened a satchel at his feet, pulled out a box and held it out. I took it without touching his skin and opened it. Slowly inside were flash drives, letters, documents, sealed transcripts from council meetings, recordings of late-night calls, with the bishop names, dates, everything. I kept it all, he said, because one day I knew someone would come and ask for it, and I didn't want to lie then. I asked him why now, why the funeral, why the envelope. "Because I'm tired, Ruth. and because he deserved a real burial. He looked back at the casket, and I realized it wasn't just symbolic. Inside lay remains, fragments from the cellar. A tooth bone slivers the ring that once marked him as my husband. The coroner had confirmed it. Partial DNA had been matched enough to prove that some of Thomas had remained behind, even if his soul had long moved on. We stood in silence as the sky turned gold behind the tree, and then he spoke again, voice low. "I won't run, Ruth. I'll walk into the station when you're ready. You have the proof, you have the town, but before that I just wanted this one thing, not for me, for him." I nodded once. Not forgiveness, not closure, not yet, but acknowledgement. And in that moment it was enough. I placed my hand on the casket, whispered his name, and finally said goodbye. Not because I was ready to let go, but because I was ready to carry him forward, no longer in grief, but in purpose. Leland followed me down the hill slowly, every step like a confession, and when we reached the gate, Detective Harris was waiting, his badge glinting in the dark, his hand on his holster, but he didn't need it. Leland raised his arms, palms out, and whispered, "I buried the truth, but she made it rise." And as they cuffed him, the town did not weep, it watched, and for the first time in years it did not look away. That night the bells rang again, not from Trinity but from every church in the parish, because Jonah had written a new hymn and the choir chose to sing it in every corner of the city, a hymn of justice, of reckoning, of light. And I stood beneath the tower, arms open to the sky, and whispered into the wind, "Thomas, we did it." They called it the Trial of Trinity. The first courtroom packed so tightly the bailiff had to lock the doors 15 minutes before it began. Reporters lined the sidewalk like vultures with cameras. The news anchors wore black like they were mourning, the very idea of faith. But I wasn't there to mourn, I was there to testify. The prosecutor began with the story of a priest, a town, a bell tower. Then he said, "A name that turned the courtroom cold, Father Thomas Holloway, vanished. Never buried until we found pieces of him under stone and silence and lies." He said, "The word lies like it burned." And I felt the burn in my throat too. Leland Hart sat in the defendant's chair, wearing the same rumpled grey suit from the funeral, hands folded, to face unreadable. His lawyer said he was coerced, manipulated by the late Bishop Callahan, that he had merely followed orders. I wanted to scream that obedience is not a shield against evil, that hiding behind doctrine is how monsters wear robes, but instead, I waited until they called my name. When I took the stand, the crowd stilled, even the air felt thinner. I held Thomas' journal in my hands like a relic, the leather warm from my grip, and when the prosecutor asked me to explain how it all began, I told them everything, no tears, no stuttering, only truth. I spoke of the night the bell tower fell silent, of the bones that clattered onto holy ground, of the choir boy, who finally found his voice, of Eleanor Callahan's trembling hands and her husband's black deeds. I spoke of the garden and the poet, serpent, and the serpent's disciple buried like a saint, and I spoke of my husband who tried to lift the veil and was swallowed by it. Leland didn't look at me once, not even when they played the recordings from the tapes he kept, not when his voice echoed in that chamber, saying things no man should say, in God's name, not even when they projected the photo of Thomas bound on, in the bell tower floor. He just stared ahead, eyes dead as ash. Then came Jonah again. This time, not trembling. He read from the final entry in his own journal, not a confession, but a reckoning. He said, "I carried this for 11 years, and I thought silence was protection, but it was a prison, and when I broke it, I found not judgment, but healing." And he looked at me and smiled, and I smiled back because courage recognizes itself. The defense tried to discredit the documents, called them forged, said the church had already excommunicated Monroe and the Brotherhood years ago. But Detective Harris rose to the stand and read from Monroe's own journal, outlining the rituals, the selection, the sacrifice. And when he said Thomas's name, even the judge looked down. Eleanor testified last. They wheeled her in frail skin, paper-thin voice like lace, but every word landed like iron. She said, "I loved my husband, but I feared him more, and I feared what he served, a belief that bled good men, and called it penance. I let it happen because I thought I was protecting the church, but I was only protecting power, and I won't die with that stain." She handed the judge her own copy of the bishop's writings and said, "Do not bury this again. Closing arguments were like thundergilt wrapped in scripture, truth layered with rot. The prosecutor ended with this: "We are not here to judge faith. We are here to judge what was done in its name. And if we cannot do that, then justice itself has no altar." The jury deliberated only 6 hours. The verdict: guilty on all counts accessory to murder, conspiracy, obstruction, desecration of remains. When it was read, Leland finally looked at me, but not with hatred, with emptiness, as if the truth had finally hollowed him out, and I felt no joy, only gravity, the kind that comes after a storm, when you find the walls still standing but the roof gone. Outside the courtroom, people waited not to cheer, but to understand. Candles lined the courthouse steps. Someone played a hymn from the Trinity Choir. Jonah's voice threaded through the dusk. That night, the town held a vigil, not of mourning but of promise. They walked the garden of saints where the plaque stood, laid lilies and letters at its base. Children read from Thomas' sermons for the first time in years. The church's doors were left open, and people came not because they were told, but because they chose to. Reverend Thatcher resigned, not out of guilt, but understanding. He said, "The church needs new shepherds and I am not it." He handed me the key to Thomas' old study and said, "This belongs to the one who never stopped seeking light." I didn't take it to lead, I took it to protect. The next morning, a letter arrived on my doorstep. No return. Address inside was a single sheet of paper written in sharp blue ink. To Ruth. "You carried the burden I was too weak to bear. You lifted a city from beneath its own weight and gave it back its voice. I hope you forgive me for every day. I stayed silent when I should have stood beside you. You were never just a widow. You were always the bell." It was signed by one of the last members of the council, now in hiding somewhere I would never know, but I folded it gently and placed it in the drawer beside Thomas' wedding band and the soil from the garden. Because justice isn't loud, sometimes it's just the soft click of a cell door, the rustle of old pages, the silence after the truth is finally spoken. And in that silence I found him. The church stood quiet under a grey morning sky, its stained glass windows still broken in places. The bell tower no longer just an ornament of faith, but a monument to truth and loss, and everything we had buried and dared to unearth. I walked, alone across the front steps, the wind tugging gently at the hem of my coat, and I carried with me a small box wrapped in cloth and memory, because today was not about ceremony, it was about release. Inside the sanctuary, the air held the warmth of breath and candles, the pews filled, not by habit, but by choice. These were not parishioners bound by obligation, but people who had survived the dark with their faith, not in hierarchy, but in one another. And I stood at the front altar, where the choir once faltered, and now sang stronger than ever, led by Jonah, who no longer looked like a boy who had run, but a man who had returned. He began the hymn Thomas, favorite one he used to hum while fixing the door that never closed quite right. And in that song I heard not just music but 1,000 unsaid things, the apology, the forgiveness, the hope, the pain stitched into every verse. And I closed my eyes as the sound lifted toward the rafters like smoke from an old fire. When the final note faded, I stepped forward and opened the box inside. Lay Thomas' last sermon found tucked inside a hymnal in the bell tower pages, weathered ink, faded, but every word still holding breath. I read it aloud, not as a widow, but as a witness, and the room held its breath. He wrote of redemption, not as something given but chosen. He wrote that silence is not peace, and that justice is not vengeance, and he ended with a line that had never let me go. When the bell rings again, let it not toll for what we lost, but for what we finally found. I stepped down and walked outside where the garden now bloomed lilies and sunflowers and rose bushes where children once feared. The statue now ran and laughed, and when I reached the small stone marked with Thomas' name, I knelt and placed the box beside it not as an offering but as a return. Eleanor Callahan sat on a bench nearby, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She no longer came in black but in pale blue, and she nodded when our eyes met, a gesture, not of absolution but understanding, because some wounds never close. But they no longer fester. They simply remain as reminders of what it took to survive. Detective Harris, retired the following month, said he had done what he came to do and was ready to fish somewhere. No one knew his name. He left behind a binder of notes and a photo of Thomas in front of the old bell tower, smiling just before. It all went dark. Reverend Thatcher moved away too, not in shame but in search of something smaller, something quieter. I think he learned the cost of silence too late, but he never stopped trying to repair it, and for that I do not hate him. Jonah stayed. He teaches music now, leads the children's choir every Thursday, and sometimes when I pass by and hear them practicing, I stop under the window just to let the notes fall over me like sunlight. The church never fully rebuilt. The bell tower, the cracks remain. The ropes are new, but the wood still bears the stain of history, and I ask them not to hide it because sometimes the scar is the story. And me, I stayed too. I took the key Reverend Thatcher gave me, and opened Thomas' study and filled its shelves again, not with relics but with records, witness statements, photos, testimonies, and a sign above the door that reads, "The Light Room," because truth like light only matters when it's seen. We held one final service before the season turned, where the town gathered in the garden, to each person holding a candle, and as the sun fell behind the tower, we lit them one by one, not for the dead, but for the living, and I rang the bell, myself. One single clear note, and the sound carried not just across the church, but through the town, and maybe through time. A woman approached me afterward. Her hands calloused her, eyes red, she said. Her son had once served under Bishop Callahan and never came home. She thanked me for ringing the bell. She said it gave her back something she thought was gone forever. A voice. And that's what this was always about. Not vengeance, not spectacle, just the return of what was taken. A voice. Mine. Jonas. Thomas. The town's. Yours. So if you ever find yourself staring at a closed door, a quiet church, a locked cellar, remember that silence is not always holy. Sometimes it's haunted. And if you listen hard enough, you might hear the bell waiting to ring again. And when it does, let it ring for truth. Let it ring for light. Let it ring for every soul that chose to speak when silence would have been easier. And let it ring for you. What began as a mystery wrapped in silence became a reckoning that reached every soul who had once knelt beneath the stained glass windows of Trinity Church. In peeling back the layers of a town's buried guilt, one woman showed us that truth, no matter how long it sleeps, never dies. Ruth Holloway was not just a widow. She was a bell. And when she rang, the silence broke. This is not a story about a church. It is a story about courage, about the quiet power of those who refuse to look away, about how justice is not always swift or loud, but it is real. And it is possible when someone dares to speak. The lesson here is simple but enduring. Never mistake silence for peace. When systems built to protect begin to conceal, it is not just a right, it is a moral duty to lift the veil. Because sometimes the most powerful sermon is not one shouted from the pulpit, but one lived in defiance of fear. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone who deserves to be heard, share it. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe for more powerful true drama stories like this, where the past doesn't just haunt, it demands justice. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's keep the bell ringing.